everyone. So I'm very happy to be in Montreal. I try to come often enough. My daughter lives here, but this is a perfect context for me to share my research with you, and I want to thank the organizing committee for having me here. I'm Pat Badani, as I said earlier, I think. I'm an artist, an intermedia artist, and a scholar. And I'm also editor-in-chief of a new media journal called Media N, Journal of the New Media Caucus. Now, I live in Chicago. That's my last residence for the last 10 years. I previously lived in Paris and so on and so forth. I should say that I have 4 passports and I've lived in 7 countries, and I feel at home in all of those places and more. So I live in Chicago, and as you know, Chicago is in Illinois. Illinois is in the USA Corn Belt, so it should come to you as no surprise that I'm here to talk to you about corn. The title of my essay is Sustainable Agriculture, Sustainable Culture. And in this essay, I discuss a project that I'm working on right now. The project is called Al Grano. Grano translates in Spanish into English as grain. And this project addresses the massive industrialization of corn in North America and GM debates, specifically maize contamination debates in Mexico, center of diversity for this crop. I'm locating the project and research in 2 specific regions, and these regions I'm personally familiar with. One is the Terracan Valley in Mexico. And I should say that I lived in Mexico for a decade and that I'm still very much involved with that culture. So to me, that is not an abstraction. This region has personal significance for me. And today, the Terracan Valley is the center of the debates on transgenic maize, because maize contamination was found there in 2002. And today, the area is severely impacted by this contamination, and it's at the center of not only GM maize debates, but also at the center of water and land use debates. The second region is the Illinois, cornified Illinois, as it is commonly called. I lived in Chicago, as I said earlier, but I also taught for about 10 years. I was a professor in an art department in a university in the middle of cornfield. So this region, this agricultural region, is very familiar to me because I drove past and through cornfields for about a decade, and I'm familiar with farmers and their practices. So during this time, during those 10 years that I worked in this area, I have personally witnessed the remaking of the countryside and the remaking also of the family farm as a social body. I see the debates in Mexico as representative of a larger worldwide problem, one that jeopardizes the ecology and our long-term food needs. The increasing erosion of agricultural land and water depletion begs the question, what will we eat in the future? The remaking of the countryside and the family farm as a social body also begs the question, who will grow our food in the future? Eating is a cultural and an agricultural act. And in this last decade, many of us, certainly you in this audience today, have looked at answering the question, where does the food that I'm eating today come from? We know that for the most part, the delivery is made possible by the coordination of vast systems of production, labor, transportation, and fuel systems, all regulated and often subsidized by national structures. And that these structures are furthermore moderated by international corporations and treaties. Speaking for myself, when I learn about what goes on in the food system, before the food actually arrives onto my plate, I cannot help but ask myself, is there a better way of doing things? And this is the question that drives my current project. With regards to Mexico, when I look at how things are being done in terms of agriculture and the food system, what I see is not pretty. This ugly picture has led me to delve into agricultural practices, both ancient and new, and to investigate the issues related to maize, such as the food sovereignty issues, border crossings, because we're talking about trade, and gene flow, etc., and the cultural identity issues that are entangled in all of these debates. Now, what's distinct about Mexico's relationship to corn, quite beyond the millennial creation belief systems, is that Mexican culture revolves around the consumption of that grain across pretty much all economic groups. So much so that maize has been referred to as vitamin T in a staple diet that includes tortillas, tacos, tostadas, totopos, tacayos, and tamales. The association between maize and Mexican culture is so strong, so central, that a commonly used slogan claims, sin maíz no hay país. And for those of you who are English speaking, that translates to, without maize, there is no country. So with this in mind, my essay looks at these questions and these debates. Initially, I give an overview of this contested grain and its contested spaces in North America. I then discuss maize technologies in Mexico from pre-Hispanic times to the present. I include a section about the debates on GM maize contamination and what it's being done today. I conclude the essay by exploring current resistance efforts towards a sustainable agriculture and a sustainable culture, where traditional and new technologies can meet and share a place. And this is within North America, Mexico, US, and Canada. So Grano's perspective into GM maize contamination in Mexico revolves around two main issues. These are my ports of entry into the subject. And the issues are related to diversity at risk. One is biodiversity, and the other one is cultural identity risk. Grano is inscribed within bioart practices. It explores cultural narratives and ethnographic contexts that picture art, science, and technology as agents of manipulation and creation. This is a long-term project involving 2 layers of research. And because I want to reach a variety of audiences, I will use multiple distribution streams for the outputs. One of them would be lecture presentations, such as this one, publications, discussions, exhibitions, websites, and community events, of course. One layer of the project involves collaborations to research non-habitual ways of transforming maize through scientifically based experiments. The temporal pieces will spawn research essays, visual documents, and other items that can be shared in a variety of platforms, from lecture presentations and publications to performative events and to gallery installations. These experiments will resonate with the social and agricultural transformations thought necessary to challenge the abstraction of farming practices based solely on production and distribution maximization. My goal with these works is to bring to light sustainable possibilities for change. The experiments that I'm actually in the process of conducting are informed by an older work of mine dating back to 1997 called Tower Tour, and I call these Imagineered drawings, or part of a big installation of multi-year, a multi-locational project. And these drawings and these installations imagined an ecological technopolis. So in this earlier project, I also used a minuscule grain to inspect issues of global pertinence. It wasn't corn at that time, it was rather wheat. So I mentioned earlier that Grano has 2 layers. So I've just described one of them, and it's a project in process. So I've mostly showed you projections for the execution of the project, or the outcome of the project. The other layer I want to talk about involves film. I interview GM maize debate participants in Canada, the US, and Mexico, such as farm workers, lobbyists, and policymakers. The outcome of this research will include theater presentations, online broadcasts, and also a multi-channel video gallery installation. So what I'd like to do now is to show you a video that represents the embodiment of the beginning of this film. And in the video, I showcase not only corn footage, of course, but interviews with two Canadian specialists, specialists in the food system and on biodiversity. One specialist is Elizabeth Fitting, and she is an anthropologist that who works in Dalhousie University in Canada. And she spent years working in the Terracan Valley, the area that I mentioned as being the cradle of corn, and it's going to be the focus of my own work. And she wrote a wonderful book called The Struggle for Maize, Campesinos, Workers, and Transgenic Corn in the Mexican Countryside. The other specialist is Pat Mooney. He's director of ETC, located in Ottawa, and ETC stands for Erosion, Technology, and Corporate Concentration. They are a lobbying group, and they work very closely to the UN, with the UN, to transform research into actual policy, public policy, and they're very effective in doing that. So with that, having said that, I would like to show the video.
In the GM corn debates, one of the things that has happened is that maize, which has always been a symbol of the Mexican nation, of Mexicanness, has come to represent Mexican culture really at risk of homogenization in an era of neoliberal globalization. Mexico is the center of biodiversity for this crop. It's an enormously important symbol of what it means to be Mexican.
It has become a hot button topic, not just in Mexico, but around the world, because this is the first case where GM contamination has gone into a center of diversity, and that's Mexico, and that's corn.
NAFTA has been a key part of the neoliberal corn regime. These are policies that prioritize imports. Mexico is now importing its most culturally important crop. And I think in the case of corn, in the case of maize in Mexico, if we're talking about imported corn, it's yellow corn called pig food.
The most important issue, I think, in the GM debate in Mexico is really the concerns of indigenous peasants there who are trying to protect their food security and their food sovereignty. It affects their livelihood, it affects their survival. I mean, they may not survive. In a sense, the GM contamination of the maize crop in Mexico is a case where biopiracy as well, because it's really stealing away the diversity that's been available to indigenous peoples there and stealing away their food security in order to impose the GM varieties they want to get in, the companies want to get into Mexico. Mexico carries on destroying its own genetic diversity in maize, carries on allowing the multinationals into the country, has already granted the intellectual property protection the companies want, and has given them the market that they want.
We are seeing legal changes to support this kind of corporatization of life, of the seed, of something so fundamental to agricultural production. This is an example of pollution, of genetic pollution. This is an example of contamination.
And it's a case where, again, the companies said for decades that there was no danger of this kind at all. This would never happen. It wasn't conceivable. And it has happened. It's a case where the industry initially denied that it was happening and spent years, really, trying to say that the data was falsified, it can't be true. Now everyone agrees, yes, it is true, there is GM contamination in Mexico, it's been there for some time. We've had biotech in the field for more than 15 years now, and what have we got to show for it? As a reality so far, it's given us almost nothing. Science is controlled by corporatism, is controlled by the combination of what corporate interests are and what government's parallel interests are to those of the corporations. So the public research institutions are as susceptible to bad science in a way as is the agribusiness system.
Agribusiness is increasingly involved at every stage of production.
The moment politics gets involved in science, science goes out the window. It's the political interests of the companies, the political interests of the governments that dominates, and they will use science as a weapon and as an excuse to beat down the opposition.
The cultural impact of transgenic corn in Mexico is significant and that concern needs to be taken seriously. Maize is such a fundamental crop, economically, socially, culturally, politically. There should be better regulations. And there should be policies to help support the small-scale farmer who relies on traditional varieties.
For 12,000 years, farmers have saved their seed, and they've bred from that seed as well.
That grain is also a seed that can be planted and reproduced and exchanged informally or formally.
So the diversity, again, of peasant production and the ability of that peasant production to respond to climate change is vast compared to the industrial model.
Food that is produced in the industrial global food system is purged of its cultural and geographic identity.
The farmers are working in not 150 crops or really 12 crops, they're working in 7,000 different plant species. So their ability to produce diversity that can feed the world and adjust to climate change is, again, just by orders of magnitude greater than the companies. It's strange that we're at a point in history where this sort of artificial barrier between what I might want to call lab science and field science doesn't have to exist. We should be able to have a wonderful combination of shared interests in developing the best science we can for our long-term food needs, always recognizing that the solutions are not necessarily technology. The solutions may well be simply good policies.
Behind the initial debate over regulation and whether transgenic corn was appropriate technology for Mexico was a debate about the future of the Mexican countryside. The discourse of the government promoted modernizing agriculture or globalizing it. That is to say, if campesinos were to stay in the countryside, they either needed to modernize their maize agriculture, so adopt new technologies, modern varieties, or they needed to abandon corn and take up crops that do better in the global market. Really, there's a vision here of transforming campesinos into entrepreneurs or into migrants. In about a decade, 500,000 agricultural workers were displaced, and we have yet to see exactly the full ramifications of this. Who is going to grow that food in the future?
I think that the technologies we're talking about related to biotech are in a sense, being overwhelmed by the realities of both synthetic biology, which is way beyond biotech, and overwhelmed by the geopolitics of geoengineering these days. If you look at what's going to affect peasant production in Mexico 5 years or 10 years from now is very much wrapped up in these other technologies, which most people aren't even aware of now, but are going to be as dominating as GM maize is as a topic today.
Right, so this is a project in gestation, so all of this is to be continued and elaborated through the next, I would say, at least 3 years. It's a humongous project, and I do invite participants and collaborations, so if you're interested at any level of the 2 layers that I described about the project, please talk to me. Thank you so much for your time.